For me, the challenge that we face is a narrative battle. You see, I don't think we've actually done very effective narrative work in this country. We had a genocide in America, and when white settlers came to this continent, they killed millions of native people through famine and war and disease, and we forced those people from their lands. We kept their names, and we named streets and buildings and counties and things after them, but we forced them off. And because of a narrative shift, we didn't say that's a genocide. We said those people are savages. And that narrative failure to own up and acknowledge their humanity allowed us to think that we hadn't done anything immoral, but we did. And then we had the slavery and the Civil War, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. They were able to persuade the United States Supreme Court that that racial equality thing wasn't necessary. And they actually reclaimed that racial hierarchy, that ideology of white supremacy, and we allowed that to happen for 100 years. Then we had horrific terrorism and violence, and we ended the kind of mass lynchings with impunity, but those who had perpetrated that terrorism and violence won the narrative war. They were never held accountable. And then we got into the civil rights era, where there was this massive, incredible movement led by extraordinary people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks, and we won passage of the Voting Rights Act, we won passage of the Civil Rights Act, but we lost the narrative war. The people that were holding the signs that said segregation forever, segregation or war, were never forced to put down those signs. They didn't wave them around anymore, but they kept adhering to that value. And now we're living at a time where that narrative, that thriving narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white preference has exhibited itself, has manifested itself, and now we're dealing with the consequences of that. And we won an election in 2008, but we lost the narrative battle. We actually allowed that president to be demonized and victimized and marginalized because he's black, not because of anything he said or anything he did. And our comfort with that kind of demonization is, I think, at the heart of the challenge that we face. And so I want us to be engaged in legal battles in court. I want us to be thinking strategically, politically about how we reclaim federal government and make local government work for us. But we've got to start fighting a narrative battle. We've got to create a country and a culture where you are not allowed to say, I'm going to ban people because they're Muslims and win with that. You're not allowed to ban people. And there will always be people who try to exploit the fear and anger that gives rise to these kinds of narratives of racial difference. And I think we haven't done a very good job. Too many of us have kind of taken advantage of the legal battles while leaving behind the narrative battle. And that, for me, is the great challenge that we face.
Can I ask a question? I mean, because this is, I think you could not be more on point. And what I think worries me is how relentless the narrative battle has to be, right? Because, I mean, the only place where I would disagree with you is I think actually, out of the civil rights movement, we won the narrative battle-ish. And by that I mean two things. I mean, one, there were a lot of compromises on the narrative, so that you can compromise the narrative, right? You know, it's all about, you had to be peaceful and love and content of the character, you know, and all the, I have a dream, right? That, you know, so it got distorted, right? So that's number one. Number two, you never really win the narrative. You have to keep it up. And I can remember when I first came to the Legal Defense Fund in 1988, Julius Chambers was the director counsel, and I was litigating voting rights cases, and I was getting ready to file a case in Oklahoma, and had my little press release. And I remember Julius saying, you know, noble, brilliant civil rights lawyer who I just, you know, revered, we do our talking in the courtroom. You know, which is kind of a nice thing to say, but actually, that was precisely the moment when the Heritage Foundation and American Enterprise Institute they were forming their centers, you know, no, seriously. Right. And they were creating a narrative and a story. And I can remember when I started teaching constitutional law, you know, you had to get your case books and so forth. And, you know, back in the 80s, to use the words reverse discrimination to describe affirmative action was like a slur. You couldn't call affirmative action reverse discrimination. By the time I was in my 7th year of teaching, the Rotunda casebook, some of you may use it, the whole section on affirmative action is called reverse discrimination, right? So they had taken over the language because we hadn't tended to it, is what I was trying to get to, is that there was a way in which we won some of the narrative, and then, as you said, we kind of left it alone. And so you have to kind of keep at it. There's no like permanent win.
That's
you know?
Right. I think if you don't hold people accountable for the narrative assaults that they made,
that's right.
then you're never going to prevail.
That's right.
Because the South never voted for the Voting Rights Act. They never voted for the Civil Rights Act. They regrouped, started organizing in precisely the way you are describing, and then 48 years later, they won a Supreme Court case, Shelby County, because their narrative had persuaded the United States Supreme Court that we don't need the Voting Rights Act anymore.